pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future, and hope you join me in that. We are of the University of Texas at Austin. Will spent the week here and in Canberra, conversations with government stakeholders, talking to history together. We both worked in the Bush administration. Will was, in a way, the historian in residence. Big problems in policy. Organizing strategic retreat, President at Camp David, President's professor. Was political science, youth. Documents that showed different speeches, famous giving us a completely think about
Okay. Sorry, is this working? All right. I just want to thank Mike for all the nice things he said. I mean, Mike, keep going.
Yeah, well, they cut me late. Okay. So, book is about his book on Ronald Reagan. But I was going to say, we'll think about the lessons for strategic competition. Ronald Reagan had so we'll think a little bit with Will about the lessons from Ronald Reagan for the strategic competition we are now in with China. Let me first, I'll dialogue with Will, try to bit, although me, so I'm mutually assured destruction, and then your questions and thoughts as well. But look, in some ways begins with your childhood in Tucson, Arizona. We shove it in the book. And that was a very anti-Reagan poster from the 1980s. So I thought I'd start with your own personal journey and how you went from being a Reagan hater to a scholar who, going through the archives, saw in some ways, a really transformational president in terms of America's role in the world.
No, thank you, Mike. There's a lot there. Let me just also thank this is my if I can return. We're very fortunate to have this is wonderful news in life. As to evolution, in thinking about the Reagan presidency and the Cold War and how that led into this book. First, as Mike said, I grew up in Tucson, Arizona in the 1970s and 80s. And insofar as I had a political consciousness or followed world events, I was very much a young man of the left. I had a particular disdain for the Reagan presidency. And the two issues I was especially focused on were one, his nuclear weapons buildup and my real terror at the possibility of dying in a nuclear war. The Tucson part matters. I expect anyone here is very familiar with Tucson, but it is a medium-sized city about an hour. And or those mountain ranges housed about 34. Okay.
Sorry. Turn these off.
Okay, is this working now? Okay, great. In those four mountain ranges surrounding Tucson were about 30 or 40 Titan missile silos. So these were, intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear tipped missiles. And we didn't know exactly where they were, but we knew that they were in those mountains. And this also meant that the Soviets knew that they were in those mountains. And if there was going to be a nuclear war, Tucson was going to get a disproportionate share of SS-18s launched at it. And so kind of grow up in a pretty happy home in a nice, sunny, Sunbelt city with the constant low-grade terror that any day could be our last day on Earth. Right? The other part where this matters, I mentioned Tucson being just an hour north of Mexico, is there was in the 1980s a steady flood of Central American refugees coming across the border. Many of them displaced by some wars that were going on in Nicaragua and El Salvador and Guatemala at the time, which the Reagan administration was playing a part in, and we come back to that discussion. And so my church was involved in helping resettle a number of these refugees, and I was seeing some of the human costs, if you will, of this Cold War conflict. Fast forward, 30 years later, and I write this book, reassessing the Reagan administration foreign policy, and it's overall a very favorable assessment. And it's not a hagiography. And if you do have a chance to read the book, you'll see I'm quite critical of some of the policies, but overall, it's a very favorable assessment. So what changed? I want to highlight three factors, some of which relate to why I'm a fan of history and historical perspective, but some also just a personal intellectual evolution. First of all, we know now how the story ended, right? We know now that the Cold War does end peacefully. The Berlin Wall comes down, the Iron Curtain comes down, the Soviet Union itself collapses, the world is spared nuclear war. And that is one reason why I think we sometimes need an entire generation to pass before we can properly do history, is we need that critical distance. We need that removed from the time. So the way the world looked to me as a teenager in the 1980s, and those acute nuclear fears and the displacements from the Central American wars, not at all to deny the very real fears and risks that were going on there, but we now can see how that broader story ended. And so I think that historical perspective, that critical distance is one thing that goes into the book. Another factor was my own intervening time about spending about 15 years or so, primarily in Washington and some of it overseas as a policymaker. And working during that time as a policymaker, I came to appreciate more that in the policy world, there are very rarely good and easy choices to make. As I often tell my students, policymaking is not about choosing between a bad option and a good option. If you're a good policymaker, just choose a good option. Rather, it's usually involves choosing between a bad option, a really bad option, and a terrible option. And your job is to pick the bad option, right? In terms of the downside, the downside risks, the costs, sometimes the unintended consequences, those are unavoidable in the policy world. And so that my experience as a policymaker, my own time working at the White House, gave me a little bit more, what you might say, intellectual empathy for all previous presidents who have gone before, or prime ministers for that matter, any systems of government. and a different system of trying to evaluate them based on what were the choices that they faced at the time. What would some of the downsides have been of other choices they might have done? Doesn't mean that all the choices they make are the best ones. Often they're not, right? But give me a new appreciation for some of the very difficult trade-offs that the Reagan administration faced. And then finally, there was well, two other factors. One, a lot of my international policy work in the 1990s and the early 2000s involved work with Central and Eastern European countries, and as well as some time in Russia itself, and talking to people who had lived under these communist regimes, and hearing their take on the Reagan administration was by and large very favorable, saying, "Look, that president." Spoke with more moral clarity about the governments, the oppressive communist dictatorships that we were living under. We felt like finally there was a champion for our own cause, our plight outside. We're thankful to you Americans for having had him as president. This was a new perspective for me. Then finally, speaking as a scholar, especially a historian, and Mike had mentioned all of the time I spent at the Reagan Library, which is where the records of the archival records of the Reagan administration are. And I spent a lot of time at the Library of Congress and elsewhere in all the different archives. And with the turgid slowness of the declassification process in the United States, we sometimes have to wait about 30 years until a presidency is over before some of the most important National Security Council, CIA, State Department, Pentagon records are declassified. And those offer a very new window into the internal policy-making processes, the deliberations, the mind of the president himself that were just not available at the time to journalists or to other observers. And so just as the wheel turns, nothing special about me. I was one of the first scholars who happened to be working on this at a time when there were tens of thousands of pages of these new documents declassified. What kind of documents? Well, the transcripts of Reagan's meetings with other world leaders and heads of state, where we can now see what was he actually saying to them. The internal National Security Council strategy memos that Reagan was redrafting along with his staff, where you can see his thinking evolving. And again, this was all highly classified at the time. Or things like his diaries, which was just published about 10 years ago, which he had never intended to be published and certainly weren't during his lifetime. And so the opening of all these archives, the declassification of these documents now gives us a very new window into the internal policy process that the Reagan administration was going through. And that's where it also, for me, gave a lot of new insights into what I now regard was a much more sophisticated and interesting and effective strategy in the Cold War and in the Asia-Pacific and other key regions.
Were you surprised to find that through line in Ronald Reagan's thinking? I mean, the thesis of the book is compelling because of all the archival work, and the title tells the story well. Reagan wanted to win the Cold War peacefully.
Yes.
Full stop. And he thought about how to do it, and studied with scholars, and really was basing it on not just a worldview, but a considerable amount of sort of inquiry, study, discussion. Mm-hmm. Were you surprised to find that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was. And when I started the research on this book a little over 10 years ago, at that point, my thinking had evolved to generally having a fairly favorable assessment of Reagan, but still not much expertise or familiarity. So these are more instincts. And so I was still quite surprised as I delved into the research to see a number of things that you had mentioned. First, a much more sophisticated strategy in his own mind for bringing the Cold War to a peaceful end, and seeing the vulnerabilities in the Soviet Union much earlier than others did. A very early on commitment to diplomacy and to outreach to the Soviet Union. A very clear commitment to abolishing all nuclear weapons. He's terrified of nuclear weapons. Hence, those are some of the themes on why I give the book the title, The Peacemaker. It is not meant ironically. It's meant with all sincerity, and I think the record's pretty clear. By the way, I've gotten some criticism from some Reagan critics for the book title. It comes from Mikhail Gorbachev, right? So Gorbachev paid tribute to Reagan at Reagan's funeral, saying he was a great peacemaker. So your complaint is not with me; it's with Gorbachev. All right. So if you don't like the title of the book, But going back to your question about some of Reagan's early thinking, I wrote the book as a chronological narrative. Okay, so it unfolds sequentially from 1981 to 1989. The idea there partly is to make it a little more readable, so readers can feel the story unfolding as it was for Reagan and his team. But there's also an argument embedded in writing it as a chronological narrative, which is I'm trying to disabuse readers and any of us in the 21st century of what I call the inevitability fallacy. This is the belief that we now have in hindsight. Of course, the Soviet Union was going to collapse. Of course, that system was eventually going to fall apart from its own contradictions and exhaustion. Of course, the world would not be destroyed in a nuclear war. That was crazy to even think about that. And in hindsight, we can see, some of the structural factors that do contribute to the peaceful end of the Cold War. But in writing the book as a narrative, I'm trying to show that very few people saw that at the time. And Reagan and his team certainly didn't know that it was going to end that way. And every day that they went into the White House or he went behind his desk in the Oval Office, he quite literally did not know if this was going to be his last day on planet Earth. And he also knew that some of the answer to that question, if it was going to be his last day on planet Earth, depended on choices he was going to be making and how the Soviets were going to be responding. And so trying to recapture some of that radical uncertainty and the tremendous pressures and stakes of policymaking. And what most of the conventional wisdom, expert opinion at the time, very much believed that the Soviet Union was strong and durable and resilient. And it may not have had the most efficient dynamic economy in the world, but it had been around for 70, 75 years at that point and was going to continue for at least another century, right? That's what the American intelligence community largely believed. That's what most academic Soviet specialists in the United States and Europe and Asia also believed. And so for Reagan to instead believe that the Soviet Union was much more vulnerable and fragile and potentially could actually be defeated and collapsed, that was a very radical, controversial, and much criticized view at the time. And so for people today, and including many of my academic colleagues who want to say, "Oh, is this inevitable? Is all gonna fall apart?" Say, okay, maybe it was, but nobody saw that at the time. And when Reagan actually believed that that was possible, he was viciously criticized as a lunatic, as an imbecile, as a radical destabilizer of the status quo. And so we can't have it both ways. It was inevitable this was all going to happen, but also he was foolish to have seen it. And so what was that strategy? Just a couple of the key points here. It was a combination of dramatically increased pressure on the Soviet system, economic pressure, military pressure, ideological pressure, political and diplomatic pressure, but also the hand of outreach. Because again, even though he wants to collapse the Soviet system, he also wants to keep the Cold War cold. And so while increasing that pressure, he hoped that it would induce the Soviets into constructive negotiations. And so he's also, throughout his 8 years as president, extending the hand of diplomacy and looking for that off-ramp to have dialogue about the differences between the systems, to reduce the risk of nuclear war, to slash the size of nuclear arsenals. There's clearly some internal tension between the pressure and the outreach, right? And he has to recalibrate those at different times. But those two prongs are there throughout his 8 years as president. And they were very different from most previous presidents, Republicans or Democrats.
You, I'm sure, have seen the famous Saturday Night Live skit from the second Reagan term, which was when President Reagan was mired in the Iran-Contra scandal.
Yeah.
Which, if you don't know it, was almost like a novel, but transferring funds from various shady sources to get support for the Contras fighting against the communist regime in Nicaragua with arms sales to the Iranians. It was all convoluted and nuts. And President Reagan, said he didn't know. So Saturday Night Live have this hilarious skit where Ronald Reagan in front of the press is saying, "Well," and that's my Reagan imitation.
Yeah.
And this bumbling, sort of slightly senile, affable fool who didn't know what was going on. And as soon as the press leaves the room, he jumps on the phone and starts speaking in fluent Mandarin and Arabic, commanding the world stage. Your book sort of says that wasn't quite wrong.
Yeah,
he was in command, but you still have this incredible contradiction. So the archival evidence is very, very compelling now that it's being declassified and made available. He had a strategy. It was deliberate. He thought it through. And yet it was a pretty dysfunctional administration in many ways. Al Haig, the Secretary of State, fighting with Dick Allen, the first of many national security advisors. I think the only one who changed more might have been Trump. And Weinberger and Schultz could barely talk to each other, Secretary of State and Defense. It was a very dysfunctional presidency. So how do you reconcile those two realities? His through line, his strategy, his deliberateness that you find, and then kind of his inability to herd cats in his own administration. How does that happen?
No, it's a really interesting question. I call it the paradox of organizational chaos and strategic success. And again, going back to writing the book as a narrative, I also do that to highlight all of this administration infighting and leaking and backstabbing and an organizational chaos, because in the midst of these very big policy challenges he's facing and strategies he's trying to develop, he has an incredibly fractious and divided administration, and he's a terrible manager. He's personally conflict averse. He wants everyone to get along. He anytime his staff is fighting and leaking against each other, which is all the time, he refuses to enforce order or to confront the ones who are out of line. He's very reluctant to fire anybody. He just does not like that personal conflict. And so the way I try to somewhat reconcile these, or at least explain all of it, is first of all, his administration does have some real catastrophes. The Iran-Contra scandal is one. The suicide bombing that kills 241 Marines in Beirut on the peacekeeping mission is another one. Those policy catastrophes are largely a function of this management chaos, right? And we can, in further Q&A, I can give you some of the details on all that. So it really does have some cost. However, on the big strategic priorities that Reagan really cared about, and I'll mention two of them. One, of course, is his new strategy for of combining pressure and outreach towards the Soviet Union. Another one way is his effort to transform the American strategic posture in the Asia-Pacific, of deepening America's ties with Japan, recalibrating, pulling a little bit back from the initial partnership with China that Nixon and Kissinger and Ford and Carter had all continued. On those two big ones, Reagan does exercise a stronger hand. He is well informed on those issues. He's got a clear strategic vision, and with both of those, he usually sides more with his Secretary of State George Shultz, who's more in line with him, and he is more willing to make some of the hard choices or to become much more personally involved. And so that's how I try to reconcile this organizational chaos and some of the better outcomes, at least in those areas. But I also say the disclaimer, don't try this at home. This is no way to run an office or a household, let alone a superpower.
I wonder if in a Westminster system like Australia's, if a prime minister could survive or could have survived the Iran-Contra scandal, the Beirut bombing, and then the economic downturn before the 84 election. I suspect in the Australian system, there would have been, if not an election or no confidence vote, a spill where the prime minister's own party replaces him. So Reagan was lucky he was in a federal presidential system and not a Westminster system.
Initial term, survives that, and then once you're reelected, you got the former. Although he almost does get impeached over Iran-Contra, so it does come close.
The other criticism of, let us finish and we'll take questions when we're done. Thanks. We'll bring people in a minute. So the other criticism of Reagan or attack on Reagan that you hear quite frequently is that he had Alzheimer's, and that at some point as president, he was no longer able to function as president. You went through his diaries, his notes on speech writing. What did you find?
So I'm not a medical doctor, and I never met Ronald Reagan, let alone examined him. Okay, so the first big disclaimer there is I cannot give you, the magisterial opinion on this, and I don't think anyone will ever know. That said, my best reasonably informed judgment is that his Alzheimer's did not manifest until he had left the White House. Okay, and the evidence for that is that he had a number of medical checkups in the 2 or 3 years after he left the White House, which found no evidence of anything like this. And the first real diagnosis of the Alzheimer's is not until 1994, so 5 years after he leaves the White House in '89. He does in his last 2 or 3 years as president have a number of memory lapses, or you'll see these stories about he seems kind of dazed and confused in a particular meeting, or he's in an interview and he's forgetting things and stumbling around. So what's going on there? I actually think this is an Occam's razor example of the simplest explanation is what it was. He was the oldest president in history at the time in the hardest job in the world, and he was tired. I'm 50. I get tired and forget things sometimes, and I'm just a professor. I'm not in the hardest job in the world, right? He was 77 years old at the time, 6 or 7 years into the presidency. Like I said, the fate of the world resting on his shoulders, and he was tired and stressed. And when you're tired and stressed and of that age, you're going to forget things. And so I think it was really as straightforward as that.
And rode regularly on horseback. When he was shot by Hinckley, the doctor said his muscle mass stopped the bullet. He was in such good shape.
Yeah, very good
And
physical condition.
it is a bit of a sobering thought, though, because our current president is older.
No. Since then, the United States, you don't need me to tell you this, has had 2 older presidents than Ronald Reagan. Donald Trump was older than him, and Joe Biden is older than both of them. So
People just live longer and healthier for
Yeah.
more now, right?
yeah,
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
I want to turn to the present, but to do that transition, I want to ask you a bit about how to use history as a tool of statecraft and strategy and policy. You've thought about this and written about it. You did it in the White House, and you're on advisory committees now for the State Department on how to use history. So what's the right way to use history for contemporary statecraft? What's the wrong way?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. A lot there. I'll just give a few general observations, and I'll even tie a couple of these to some of the insights from the Reagan administration too, but then some more general ones. So, the first disclaimer is history can be used very poorly and in a very distorted ways in policy. So a classic one in the United States is, anytime there's some policy debate over whether the United States should, take a stronger stance and send our troops overseas or not for something. The arguments come down to, is this another Vietnam or another Munich, right? And those are just, wrenched out of context, and it's just, arguing over bad analogies. I'm not saying there's nothing to be learned from Vietnam or from Munich, but those are complicated, and they were also unique moments. Where I find the Reagan administration's use of history interesting, and then I'll pivot into some of the more general observations, is history as a repository of a certain set of values and a way to sometimes cast a vision for the future. What do I mean by that? Reagan is a child of the Depression and World War II, right? So those are his formative years, the 1930s, Great Depression, and then, of course, the American entry into World War II. And he would often refer back to those in his time as president. One, he would use the 1930s as a real cautionary tale against protectionism and isolationism. So he's very committed to American international leadership, international engagement. He's very committed to an open and free trading order. He faced tremendous pressures from the American public in the 1980s to be much more protectionist, especially towards Japan, also towards Taiwan, frankly, and South Korea. And he was very resistant to that. And he would often appeal back to the 1930s saying, we tried that in the 1930s, and it stymied our own economy, and it hurt the economies of a lot of the rest of the world, and it contributed to the rise of militarism in Japan and in Germany, right? Then World War II, for him, a number of the takeaways there. One, that's where he gets his first commitment to allies, right? So he sees the importance of the American alliance in the war with the United Kingdom, our partnership with China, to defeat totalitarianism. And he thinks that the United States is better with allies than without them. And that we had learned that, especially when we, speaking as American, are facing a totalitarian foe. Then, of course, Nazi Germany and later in the Cold War, Soviet communism. He also, however, has some important takeaways from the end of World War II and American policy after that. And he would often talk to Gorbachev about this, saying one of the other takeaways for the United States in World War II is we are at our best as a country when we are turning our adversaries into friends. And of course, this is, it comes at, tremendous cost in case of Japan. But he said, rather than trying to just, turn Japan into an American colony or a 51st state or something like that, we wanted to help them rebuild, become a market democracy, and become our most important ally in Asia. Similarly with Germany, or in this case, it was West Germany, right? He would often say, look, they are now our most, one of our most important allies in Europe after being one of our mortal enemies. And he also would often talk about the importance of American self-restraint at the end of the war, that when we had, in 1946, 50% of global GDP, an absolute nuclear monopoly, being the only nuclear power in the world, and troops stationed around the world. Again, he said that there was a deliberate choice, and instead of trying to be a new hegemonic empire, rather to help create a more collaborative international order to self-limit some of our own sovereignty with helping create the United Nations and so on. So Reagan would often tell this story to other heads of state and saying, these are the principles I still believe in for America. And he would also often make these appeals in his speeches to the American people, who were getting weary of 4 decades of the Cold War and wondering why we had to have this open trading order that allowed goods to be flooding our markets and hurting American jobs and so on, as some of the protectionists would say. And then finally, with Gorbachev, when he's appealing for reducing nuclear arms and the threat of war, he'd say, "Listen, we have a track record of showing some historical restraint here." So those are some ways that I think were a more judicious use of history. A few others to toss off, not so much related to the Reagan administration. History is a laboratory for policy experimentation, right? And so anytime policymakers in the contemporary moment are wrestling with a new challenge, North Korea's nuclear program, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the challenge of a rising and certainly a sort of China. When policymakers are sitting around, the White House Situation Room table, or the comparable ones in other foreign ministries, their minds are going to start going at what policies have we tried in other contexts in the past, and what worked and what didn't. Not so much analogizing, like I said, like avoid another Vietnam, but rather just what policies, what policy instruments are available to us. And so history is a laboratory for policy experimentation. And finally, many other things I should say. History helps disabuse countries of their own narcissism and give them a window into how other countries and other leaders might be seeing the world, right? So the United States would do well to pay attention to China's history if we're trying to figure out the new challenge from China. Paying attention to Russian history to understand how Putin sees the world. I'm not an apologist for Putin, right? But we at least need to understand his own use of history if we're going to in turn be trying to marshal effective policies. So.
When we were in the White House, you were the only historian, PhD. There were about 4 or 5 of us with PhDs in political science: Scotty Rice, Victor Chami, Peter Fever. All the political scientists came out of that experience and wrote the next big book was in history. Yeah, because of what you said. And Reagan's ironclad commitment and interest in alliances was reciprocated. He was lucky in some ways because he was emphasizing alliances as the cornerstone of American strategy when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister of the UK, Nakasone emerged in Japan, Mulroney in Canada, Helmut Kohl in Germany. My favorite place to sit when I would go to the State Department for meetings with Condoleezza Rice, when she was Secretary of State, was they had the old Williamsburg G7 table, the original table where those leaders met with brass plates. And I would always sit down on the Nakasone seat. Someone else would grab the, Thatcher seat. We didn't have a G20 yet, so there was no Bob Hawke seat. Where he wasn't lucky was New Zealand, but that's another story. Because that alliance was a casualty of the 1980s. Okay, so that's a good caveat on how to use history, prudently in analyzing foreign policy problems. But so let's use it. Let's take the Reagan book, the Cold War, and look at the geopolitical challenge we have with China. Are we in a Cold War with China? Would Reagan look at this and say, I know that, I've seen that play, it's a Cold War?
Yeah. I won't presume to speak for President Reagan, may he rest in peace. But yeah, my own assessment is we are in a new Cold War with China right now. As we were talking earlier today, anytime I say that, then need to put out the disclaimer about the discontinuities or differences between the first Cold War and the new one now. The levels of economic interdependence between China and the U.S., as well as China and other countries in the Indo-Pacific. China does not have a comparable Warsaw Pact. The nuclear balance is different. China is not, the Chinese Communist Party is not trying to promote communist ideology globally in the same way that the Soviet Union was. So there's not a perfect analogy, but insofar as this is a competition between the United States and a nuclear-armed communist superpower on the Eurasian landmass, right there, the same structural factors. This has only happened 2 times in history. One was the first Cold War. The other one is the circumstances that we're in now. The fact that the competition is playing out with all elements of national power, economically, diplomatically, ideationally, and of course the military balance, and that it's happening globally. The contest for influence on every continent. And I do think the fact that there is a pretty strong element of a battle of ideas. Like these are 2 different views of how a good society is organized and how the world, the international order, should be organized as well. That was, I think, one of Reagan's insights into the Cold War itself, of privileging that competition of ideas. But also, so those are some of the continuities or parallels between, say, the conflictual aspects of this, but also is important to be said that it's also cold, right? In terms of, this is not a direct force-on-force hot war military conflict between the United States and China. And that same direct force-on-force military conflict, thank God, never broke out between the United States and Soviet Union. Yes, there were localized hot wars in the Cold War, Vietnam, Korea, right? But it never came to the point of a hot war between the United States and Soviet Union. But rather it was, like I said, that decades-long competition. And I think that's also an important principle to bear in mind between the United States and China. I do favor at least some pages from the broader Reagan playbook of maintaining, speaking as an American, obviously here in the premier city of one of our most important allies, Australia, of maintaining our commitment to our allies. I think that's a sort of asymmetric advantage that the United States has, which China does not have. The same level of mutual commitments and allies there. Being confident in some of our own values. I think as a matter of deterrence, the United States does need to increase its military posture, but at the same time, keep the channels of communication open, keep the channels of dialogue open, look for some of those diplomatic off-ramps, make clear that there's certainly a willingness to engage in the diplomacy part too, to manage the tensions and maybe even look for some sort of peaceful settlement. So those would be some of the analogies or continuities I'd find between the first Cold War and this current one that we're in.
We'll finish, sir, and then we'll open up to the audience. We'll have a section of this when you can jump in, but not before. What was, anyway, didn't Reagan one day say, I paid for this microphone?
That's in the New Hampshire primary. Yeah.
I'm paying for this microphone. So, but you get your chance, just like the New Hampshire primary. So, you'll probably lose your license to practice history if you actually answer this, but the WWRRD, what would Ronald Reagan do question? Yeah. He famously was asked, how does the Cold War end? And he said, simple, we win, they lose. Which if you apply to the current circumstances would mean the end of the Chinese Communist Party. And there are Republicans, for sure, and some Democrats who talk about the competition in those terms. It's a competition with the Chinese Communist Party. When they're gone, we'll all be safe. That's not how the Biden administration articulates it, but is that an apt lesson?
Yeah. So I've been wrestling with that one. I will say I would not lament if the Chinese Communist Party lost its monopoly in power. Right. So I think it's been a overall a very, very destructive government. I believe in at least the possibilities and the benefits of pluralism, of self rule. of democracy. And I would, certainly hope that the people of China would have that opportunity. And maybe if the Chinese Communist Party wanted to be one of several political parties competing for votes and support, then that could be welcome. So it's not necessarily the abolition of them, but certainly the end of their monopoly on power. And I think the thriving and vibrant democracy that we've seen on Taiwan gives the lie to the notion that the Chinese people, as a cultural or ethnic matter, are incapable of governing themselves. I reject that. But as a geopolitical matter, is that necessary for the the resolution of the new Cold War that I'm suggesting that the United States and China are in? I don't think so. I think that there could certainly be, at least in theory, the possibility of some sort of entente where China would agree to reform some of its more aggressive international behavior, such as militarizing the South China Sea and disrupting some of what has been a peaceful and open maritime order. I don't know if they could reverse their strangling of Hong Kong democracy, but I would want to see that. I see that as an example again of some of this outside aggression. But it's not a perfect analogy at all. But in the case of Vietnam, there still is one-party communist rule there, but Vietnam is certainly not an adversary of the United States, and so that by itself does not mean it's going to be adversarial. And there's possibilities for cooperation. So,
as John Los Gatos writes in his famous Strategies of Containment, there were multiple strategies to contain the Soviet Union, but they were all essentially defensive.
Yeah.
And it was Reagan who, with an early National Security Council strategy document, said we are in effect going on the offense.
Yeah.
We're gonna transform the international system. And that's not where the Biden administration is. And I don't think that's where the majority consensus is in the Congress.
So,
It's still that we're going to defend the order
yeah.
against the challenges. Wonder if Reagan were alive today, if he would say, you might as well get to the hard part now, or if he'd say, no, that's quite right. China is very, very different.
Yeah, and that's where I honestly don't know.
Lose your historian's license.
Yeah, no, yeah, because just thinking about timing, right? When Reagan becomes president, the Cold War, the Soviet Union had been in existence for 73 years, and the Cold War had been going for at least 35 years, right? And so the conflict had already gone through several phases, and he was certainly seeing more vulnerability among the Soviets than I think the CCP necessarily has. And so I'm not making this exact analogy, but if one were to just try to map, one conflict or competition onto the other, the current moment would be more like the earlier mid 1950s, kind of much earlier in it, when Eisenhower rightly rejected rollback because that just the timing was not right. So some of Reagan's strategic acuity, I think, was from recognizing it is now time to move from that containment and management framework to now more of a rollback one. That said, I'm just going to put this out here as a provocation. I'm not making any normative claims here, and this will not earn me any return visits to Beijing, but I'm not so welcome there these days anyway. The Soviet Union came into existence in 1917, and the Soviet Union ceased to exist in 1991. That's a lifespan of 74 years. The People's Republic of China came into existence in 1949. We are now in the year 2023. That is 74 years later. Xi Jinping, of course, has studied the collapse of the Soviet Union as a cautionary tale, going back to this thing about learning from history. I do not put that out there. No, you do not misunderstand. Inboden did not just sit here and predict that in the next 6 months the CCP is going to collapse, okay? But I do put that out there as a reminder that a system may appear strong and durable and almost inevitable, and it will be that until it's not. And what that timeline is for the Chinese Communist Party or American democracy or anything else, right? I mean, nothing lasts forever. I don't exactly know, but past performance does not guarantee future results.
Susan Shirk, the well-regarded China scholar in the United States, who's my guest on Age of Chessboard, my podcast this week, in her book Overreach, picks 2006 as the year that China began to turn in a far more competitive and ambitious and aggressive direction for a variety of reasons. So that's about the 1950s, 1960 in the Cold War context in terms of the rest of the world sort of figuring out what to do.
Yeah.
All right. Last
important to note that was before Xi Jinping. That was under Hu Jintao. Yeah.
So last application of history to the contemporary world, and then we'll open it up, I promise. Ronald Reagan was considered dangerous even within the Republican Party. My mom was a Republican. I remember her being very nervous about Reagan because she was a big Gerald Ford supporter. And probably he was the most conservative and ideological candidate other than Barry Goldwater.
Oh yeah.
Right. So certainly more than Nixon, certainly more than Eisenhower.
Yeah.
And yet he pulled together a coalition that included the religious right, that included the moderate sort of Republicans like my mom, that included Democrats, the famous Reagan Democrats. He won by adding, not by subtracting. Is it possible today in the Republican Party? Is there a possibility the current Republican Party, given all the structural changes, can produce another Reagan who can build that kind of coalition and a foreign policy, that maybe not the same, but is that internationalist foreign policy?
I hope so. Right now, this is more wish than prediction necessarily, but just in terms of wanting to see a political formula that actually works. Reagan's vision of a more hopeful, optimistic, unifying tone of politics by addition rather than subtraction, of trying to unite both the Republican Party, which was deeply divided when he ran and became president, and he had many detractors there. This is why he picks George H.W. Bush as his vice president. They had been rivals before; they had no friendship before. Bush represented the moderate northeastern wing of the party. Reagan, the more insurgent movement conservative southern and western wing, and Reagan wanted to unite the party. So he said, I'm going to bring in as my vice president the exemplar of that other wing that hates me, that has been trying to defeat me, right? But then also he did not just want to unite Republicans. He really did want to unite the rest of the country as well. And so he would criticize the ideas of his political opponents, but he was very careful never to engage in ad hominems. This is why in 1984 he sets records that still stand for a landslide victory of something like 60% of the popular vote, and winning 49 states. Right. That was, so these were many Americans who were not, there was a lot of independents and Democrats who were voting for him. And I think that was a function of a few things. One, most voters are not terribly ideological. Most voters are going to vote depending on if they feel like their lives are getting better and whatever policies they're living under are working. And by 1984, Reagan's policies seemed to most Americans to be working. They were getting better jobs. Crime was going down. They were feeling more hope and optimism about the future, and they were feeling a little more safe and secure in the Cold War too. That foreign policy was certainly there. But there also was a pragmatism of him, right? So he would have his convictions, but he was also very willing to cut deals with Democrats, with other moderate Republicans. He's constantly wheeling and dealing with Congress. He also was compromising and making deals with Mikhail Gorbachev as well. And he would often say, I don't want to, if I can get 80% of what I'm hoping for, whether it's a tax policy or nuclear arms reduction, I'm going to take that. I'm not going to hold out for the final 20% and then lose it all. He would say, or go flying over the cliff on some sort of ideological crusade because I can't get that. And so that was a rare gift of having that combination of principle and conviction, but also pragmatism and being willing to cut a deal. I don't see any particular figures right now in the Republican Party who are galvanizing a lot of this. Some would have the potential to. You and I both have admiration for Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, who's running for president right now. He's certainly got some of these more Reagan-esque tones, which I appreciate. Glenn Youngkin, the Virginia governor, who may run for president, would potentially have a path to embrace this particular model. I like to think that a critical mass of the American people would respond well to this, but the last few years of American politics have disproven that thus far. So, yeah.
And you put it in the book, Reagan used to be a Democrat and he headed a trade union, the Actors Guild. So he knew how to speak to the other side.
Yeah. And had not completely rejected a lot of those values either. So
the next president who used to be a Democrat was Donald Trump.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And Trump got the Reagan Democrats.
Yeah.
Completely different worldview, personality, and likely position in history, but he was able to do it.
And Trump always hated Reagan. There's a little vignette in my book in 1987 when Reagan is president. Donald Trump is just this kind of flamboyant, occasionally bankrupt New York real estate developer. Trump takes out full-page ads in the New York Times and Washington Post, lambasting Reagan's foreign policy, saying he detests Reagan's open trade, he detests Reagan's commitment to allies. He thinks that Reagan is being played like as a sucker by making America look weak in the rest of the world, and so on and so forth. Reagan pays no mind to this, but it was something of a foretaste of the what President Trump would later become.
All right, now I will open it up, please. You've been patient, sir.
Yes.
Right here.
Okay.
Wait for the mic if you could.
I understand that, finding examples of history and trying to draw lessons. Did your work of a sort of like a fundamental that runs through in the use of history? Mm-hmm. Is there a sort of a consistent one rule? That's question one. Question two, I don't know if it's going to come out right. In terms of using parallel, the American reaction to an enemy increasing its influence on an island off its shore, Cuba, and its is there a parallel or even perhaps a justification in China responding to a perceived enemy increasing influence of an island off its shore?
And just to clarify on the Cuba one, are you referring particularly to the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62, or more just the general that for several decades there's been a communist regime there? Okay, so yeah. So on the first one, a general theory of history. Boy, there are a lot there. I will say that usually I think the most insightful and responsible uses of history reject a grand theory, right? So rejects a Marxian historical dialectic or some other ideological belief in a particular engine of history, and rather treat history as more of a broad tableau of the human experience, if you will. I don't want to sound too ethereal here, right? But as more revealing of complexities and ranges of possibilities, sometimes cycles. Sometimes there will be cycles. I'm a little leery of too much of a rigid embrace of a cyclical view of history, okay? Because I don't believe in inevitabilities. But just to give you one example of where some historical cycles can be insightful, this gets back to what we were talking about before. I have found, and this is not completely unique to me, but there is about a roughly within Republican foreign policy debates, there's about a 20 to 30 year recurring cycle oscillating between internationalism and isolationism, right? So the 1900s, early 1900s, Teddy Roosevelt, and an earlier Henry Cabot Lodge, very committed as Republicans to American international leadership and engagement. The 1920s and 30s is when the first resurgence of Republican isolationism under Harding and Coolidge comes along. Then with Vandenberg in the 1940s, a return to internationalism, but then with Bob Taft in the 1950s and then squaring off against Eisenhower, isolation. Yeah, I can take this forward, right? Okay, so there's some of these recurring historical dynamics, but I don't want to get locked into that saying that there's therefore inevitably going to be this pattern. Okay. Cuba and Taiwan. I guess a couple of the differences I would see between both situations is one, Taiwan. Think of the current government, like I said, is democratic, and this represents the self-determination of the 22 million people living on the island, who I don't see any evidence of any offensive or hostile intent that they pose towards the mainland. Whereas in the case of Cuba, since the revolution in 1959, there has not been a free and fair election, so we don't really know whether this one-party police state represents the aspirations and preferences of the Cuban people. Okay, yeah.
So an armed Taiwan would be as you know, worrisome as an armed Cuba to the big power nearby is the point, right? Yeah.
I guess if the United States were to station offensive nuclear weapons in Taiwan, I could see that more threatening to China. Yeah. So, yeah.
Also, Cuba's one island. Taiwan, we're talking Taiwan, Japan, Philippines, and even Australia in the island chain that that's looking at this. But it is an interesting question. It gets back to Will's point about you need to understand the historical perspective of the other side. Stephen, can you wait for the mic? Sorry, we want the millions of people listening online to be able to hear your question.
Very good question. In part, yes, but here I would want to elaborate that the Reagan administration's successful policies in the Cold War, which I argue they were, benefited from every previous Cold War president. Right, and I'll come back to the Nixon part in particular and the detente role, but Reagan's first foreign policy mentor in the 1960s was Dwight Eisenhower. I do a little vignette on that in the book. Reagan had a particular reverence and appreciation for Harry Truman. And Reagan had read NSC 68 closely and would often reference, right? Reagan benefited quite a bit, even though he had run against and defeated Jimmy Carter. Reagan benefited from the beginnings of the military buildup that Carter had launched. He benefited from a number of covert actions that the Carter CIA had started. He benefited from Carter having concluded the treaties to return the Panama Canal to Panama, things like that, right? Nixon and détente. I think that détente was the right policy at the time. I think it represented some real strategic genius on the part of Nixon and Kissinger. When you and I were talking earlier today, I was just finishing up a brief tribute to Henry Kissinger, who turns 100 on Saturday. And I say in there, his accomplishments was helping to reduce Cold War tensions and to recalibrate America's posture, particularly towards the Soviets. And out of détente, you get SALT I, you get the first real meaningful arms control treaty between the United States and Soviet Union. You get a renewed commitment to some crisis management channels, things like that. So insofar as détente had prevented the world from being destroyed in nuclear war, then Reagan certainly benefits from that. However, I also think that Reagan's critique of détente, which he really starts unloading in 1976. In hindsight, I do think was prescient, and the critique of it, comes down to this: he appreciated that détente had been a temporary needed measure to reduce Cold War tensions, but he worried that it was becoming a permanent state of being where the United States was committed to a more conciliatory posture of reducing defense spending and not supporting anti-communists around the world, and the Soviet Union was continuing to build up and taking advantage of détente. He also worried that détente, as a diplomatic measure, was conceding the domination and oppression of the Soviet Union on the Warsaw Pact in perpetuity. And he said, look, these are captive peoples, right? They did not choose to have these governments. And in the name of geopolitics, it is wrong for us to consign them to, the permanent oppression under the Soviet Union. So as he once put it, he said, by the late 70s, détente means losing as slowly as possible. And so that's why he was committed to reversing that. So I do think at the time he comes along, it was the right time to move beyond the détente framework.
Both Nixon and Reagan were animated by the principle that diplomacy has to be backed by power.
Yeah.
In Nixon and Kissinger's case, it was the China play, which had a direct role in pushing the Soviets to the negotiations for what became détente.
Yeah.
And in Reagan's case, strengthening alliances, the military buildup, especially our naval and than Star Wars, the SDI.
Yeah.
But
And deploying the.
so the means,
Pershing
they
twos
both
and-
saw the means and ways to get to where they wanted to be the same.
Yeah.
And it's not the way that Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton or Barack Obama saw it. It was a hard-headed look at power.
Yeah.
The difference, of course, was Nixon and Kissinger were trying to get to a more sustainable equilibrium. Reagan wanted the Soviet Union to collapse.
Yeah, Reagan wanted.
I mean, that's a big,
Yeah.
and it scared a lot of people,
Oh, it
including
did.
traditional Republican foreign policy thinkers like Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. Right?
Yeah, and Brent Scowcroft and others. Yeah. But one more thing on Nixon, and at the risk of, self-promotion, if you do get a chance to read the book, I think you'll find this. The Reagan-Nixon relationship is fascinating because they are fierce political rivals in the 60s and 70s. They're, two of the dominant figures in Republican politics. They both come from impoverished, humble backgrounds in the Midwest. They both find new opportunities in California to reinvent themselves. But also they, in the 60s and 70s, were fierce rivals, really hated each other. Once Reagan becomes president, Nixon becomes one of his most important informal advisors. They talk regularly. Nixon regularly writes to him. After a few years, Reagan invites Nixon back to the White House. It's Nixon's first time in 12 years setting foot in the White House after resigning in disgrace over Watergate. They don't always agree, but Reagan really comes to value Nixon's advice on dealing with the Soviets. At one point, when Gorbachev was resisting doing another summit with Reagan, Nixon travels to Moscow and sits down with Gorbachev. This is summer of '86, and says, "Listen, this guy Reagan is really someone you can trust and work with. He is, the only one just as Nixon was the only one who could go to China. He said Reagan is the only one who has enough of the conservative credentials to cut a real meaningful deal with you and sell it to Congress." And that's what persuades Gorbachev to then do the Reykjavik summit. So Nixon plays a really key role.
Other questions? Yes, sir. And then I'll work my way to the left. You have to hold it a little close to your.
Needed in people in the United States early, and secondly, sort of far removed from that, what would Ronald Reagan made of Vladimir Putin and his notion that the collapse of the Soviet Union is the greatest tragedy of the 20th century? How do you think you might have handled it? I know that's totally theoretical.
Yeah, there's a lot there. So, okay. Well, on the first one, for those who didn't hear it, the question was part of Reagan's strategy to outspend the Soviet Union, especially on the military front. Absolutely. Yeah. And Reagan was very explicit about that. He said the Soviets liked the arms race better when they were the only ones running in it. And he would say, I think, believing in the dynamism and prosperity of America's market economy, that if we start putting substantially more resources into our military, it will lure the Soviets into an arms race that they just can't sustain. But and that's a fairly widely held view. And I think that is true and accurate, but it's also incomplete. Reagan did not just intend his military modernization to outspend and outbuild the Soviets. He intended it to outsmart them. And this is where, remember, he had been the two-term governor of California in the 60s and 70s when Silicon Valley really first came into being, when it had its first boom. So he's a great believer in the free world, in the United States, technology, innovation, creativity. And so he is putting all this money not into just buying more tanks and planes and bullets and bombs and so forth, but better ones. He's putting money into the next generation of weapon systems that have a qualitative advantage over the Soviets' quantitative advantage. And if we had more time, I could walk you through all the details about tank killing platforms, better quieting technology on our nuclear subs, terrain hugging, B-1 bombers, the stealth technology, all of this, right? And Gorbachev is fascinated by this and terrified by it because Gorbachev realizes no matter how many more rubles I throw at buying more T-72s or deploying more SS-18s, I can't keep pace with the American technological advantage. And that's why the Strategic Defense Initiative is the apex of all that. So yes, so there's more to the Reagan defense buildup, and partly it's outspending, but it's also just, like I said, outsmarting. On Putin, well, Reagan would disagree that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a geopolitical catastrophe. He would say it's probably one of the greatest geopolitical events. I think, I can't say for sure, but I think he'd find Putin an utterly loathsome character. I think that we do know that the Reagan doctrine, which involved providing American weapons to other people who are fighting for their own freedom against Kremlin aggression, you know, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, the UNITA rebels in Angola and elsewhere, is exactly what the United States and our allies, including, you know, Australia, are doing with supporting Ukraine right now, right? So, so I think Reagan would be committed to that. But he would also, you know, be mindful of crisis management, of being cautious about an escalatory spiral. He wouldn't want to see this turn into a nuclear exchange. And so I would think and hope there'd be some efforts at keeping diplomatic channels open too.
I suspect Reagan would have had a witticism like John McCain's, which I know you know, 20 years ago when President Bush said he met Putin and looked in his eyes and saw his soul. John McCain said, I looked at Putin's eyes and I saw three letters, K, G, and B.
Yeah.
And of course, McCain was a huge, I mean, Ronald Reagan transformed his life. He was a Reagan Republican through and through.
Yeah.
I'm going to keep going this way. Yeah, Cam. Oh, sorry, you go ahead and then Cam.
But it's just a matter of me wanting to anyone.
Oh, sorry.
No, so I think, I mean, what I hear in the question, which is an interesting question, is how much of the Ronald Reagan received to history is manufactured? Like, how do you? Well, can we go with the first part of the question, or at least what I heard in it, which the first part intrigued me, so I'm going to go with that, which right. Right. So let's go with what I was hearing in the first part of the question, which is an interesting one, which is, as a historian, for example, how do you deal with the Ronald Reagan or any other prominent political figure as they're received in history? This is a political leader whose entire persona was generated by consulting groups. He was an actor. You know, it's a classic challenge of biographers.
Yeah.
As an Asia scholar, used to teach a class of Asian leaders. Scholars had a really hard time explaining Ho Chi Minh because the Communist Party in Vietnam had created this whole mythology around him, and but no one could actually verify it, and it was received as him. So, as a historian, how do you sort of deal with that?
Yeah, so this was I I will answer the question by dodging it a little bit. Okay, so bear with me here, right? So, and I think I see what you're getting at here too.
You could let him
Yeah,
finish.
yeah,
Thanks.
right. So, so my book is a history of Reagan administration foreign policy, right? So notice what it isn't. It is not a biography of Ronald Reagan. It is not a, birth to death, tradition of life. It's not even a history of his whole presidency. It doesn't get into domestic policy or anything like that. And I wrote it that way partly because I thought there was enough just of interesting things to say about the foreign policy, but also I did not think that I would, if I tried to do a biography, be fully able to get inside his head and understand him, because no one really has. He's a very enigmatic personality. Has confounded many a biographer, partly because there's many layers to him, partly because he himself would not always be introspective. He had no close friends in life, right? The one person he's close to is Nancy Reagan, his wife. But Reagan was the son of an abusive alcoholic father and grew up in a very insecure, traumatizing home with many moves. And so he never, in a lot of ways, he was very distrustful of other people and that he wouldn't really let them in. And yet he also had coped with that. And this is why he was a bad manager too, because he's so conflict averse. But he also had coped with that by adopting a more sunny, optimistic, hopeful personality and wanting to look on the brighter side of things. This is one reason why I think he succeeded somewhat in Hollywood, is he's able to inhabit these different personas, as you were asking. And I don't think it is a slight or smear on him to say that he brings some of that actor's persona to the White House. Well, yeah, not so much an illusion, but just appreciating the ceremonial roles of the office, the stagecraft as statecraft, right? And this is not unique to the American presidency. I mean, every political leader you have to have some ways of connecting with the people and casting a broader vision for them, and then inhabiting this particular role, and yet realizing that the role you're in is larger than who you are as a person. And so there's one reasonably good biography of him titled President Reagan, subtitle The Role of a Lifetime, right? And it's not meant to disparage him. It's saying that he appreciated the theatrical aspects of it. That's why he spends a lot of time on his speeches and on crafting the communications he wants to the American people. That's why he pays attention to the pageantry and imagery. So his iconic D-Day anniversary address, The Boys of Point du Hoc, he is standing there atop the cliffs at Point du Hoc looking out over Utah Beach. When he says, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, he's standing at the Brandenburg Gate with the Berlin Wall behind him, right? So connecting the ideas and principles of his strategy to the imagery, and in turn trying to use that to mobilize public opinion, there is some of the imagery there. So that's a very good question.
But your book is not a psychological biography of Ronald Reagan. It's identifying the role of Ronald Reagan in the foreign policy of his presidency.
Yeah.
And the conclusion is it's far more significant than most historians have recognized because of the archival things you found. Cam.
So a good interpretation to this question, because you made the point that Reagan came to the First World War before the end of it, and the beginning of this one. My question really hinges around proxy wars. So
Yeah. No, it's a very good question. And this is what I just made a passing reference to when I was talking about some of the dissimilarities is the CCP today is not sponsoring, global insurgencies or revolutionary movements the way that the Soviet Union was doing. So just to, a little refresher here for us, which I had to be reminded myself in working on the book on what things look like. So just between 1973 and 1980, just in that 7-8 year window, South Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Angola, Mozambique, South Yemen, Nicaragua, Grenada, Afghanistan, all fall to communism, all sponsored by the Soviet Union, not entirely engineered by the Soviet Union, right? We're not seeing, comparable moves now. And so the Reagan doctrine of supporting, insurgencies against that, the Contras in Nicaragua, UNITA in Angola, and so on and so forth, is designed in part to, support, people in those countries who don't want to live under communism, but also designed as a cost imposition strategy on the Kremlin itself. Okay, so and the Kremlin was spending billions of dollars trying to, prop up the Castro regime in Cuba, propping up the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, and so on and so forth. Reagan already sees that they're economically vulnerable, and he thinks, all right, if I can make it even more expensive for them through these proxy wars, but also especially in Afghanistan, it's not just about imposing financial costs, but we don't know the exact numbers, but probably something upwards of 50 or 60,000 Soviet soldiers are killed by American provide arms to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And that is very demoralizing to the Soviet people, and in addition to the financial costs there. And so, so in that sense, those proxy wars are a part of that broader cost imposition strategy. And there's not, I don't see a comparable one going on right now with China, except insofar as China supporting Russia and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But that's kind of a triple bank shot, as I can say. So so I don't see any direct lessons there right now. And in some ways, I hope we don't have to get into that either. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. Mhm. No, that one could be more likely, or similarly maybe just kind of access to key global trading choke points, Suez Canal, Malacca Straits, right? And the American commitment over the last several decades has certainly been to helping underwrite an open and free maritime order, preventing the domination of those by any hostile powers. As far as purely on the resource question, I think when it comes to say hydrocarbons or renewables, the United States, particularly the shale boom in the last 20 years, is a little more self-sufficient than we were certainly in the 70s and 80s, right? Especially in the 70s, we were really vulnerable to that. But so many of our allies and partners in the the globalized economic order that we're in certainly depends on secure, reliable energy supplies. And if China were to be upping its mercantilism on those, that would be that I could see some potential proxy conflicts there. So but I'll need, that's very good. I want to give that some more thought. That's a very good question.
Cam's question and your response about American arms being used by the Mujahideen to kill Soviet paratroopers and soldiers prompted me to think, actually, so did Chinese arms. I mean, a lot of what the CIA did was get weapons from the PRC, small arms and mortars and artillery, which were also used. And Reagan's
we're spending $1 billion on buying them from China and then using Chinese mules to for them. So,
both of Reagan's secretaries of state, Al Haig and George Shultz, had a pretty positive view of China. I mean, they were very different. Haig in the Kissinger tradition thought the future was with China and couldn't care at all about Japan or Australia or Korea, whereas Shultz was an allies first guy. You and I both interviewed him for books, very pro-Japan, but he was not anti-China. Shultz gave speeches that were pretty optimistic about the future of China. What did Reagan think of China? I mean, it was a useful tool against the Soviets, but what did he, in your archival research, did you get a sense of his impression? He really admired Japan. He liked Nakasone.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So,
he was an Anglophile, really liked Thatcher, but what did he think of China? It was useful against the Soviets, but what did he really?
Reagan had some real affinities for China. He was not, it's complicated. I mean, but I would say he was not anti-China, right? And his thinking evolved on China too. This is important to say. So, but first, the context is important. Through the 1970s, a succession of 3 successive American presidents, Nixon, Ford, and then Carter, all decide that the future of Asia is with China, and they think that the key to American strategy in Asia is a China first strategy, right? And at the time, that was not an implausible thing to say. I don't want to sound too dismissive at all. I mean, as you mentioned earlier, kind of bringing China more into alignment with the U.S. to counter the Soviets was a geopolitical masterstroke and the right thing to do at the time, just as détente was the right thing to do at the time. But Reagan was very concerned that this came at a cost, and two things in particular. One, he worried that the embrace of China came too much at the expense of America's historic commitment to Taiwan. And second, he thought that it was a mistake to privilege China over Japan. And so when he first becomes president in his first 2 years, and this is one of the sources of his tension with Haig, his priority is to first provide elevate the importance of Japan as America's primary strategic partner in Northeast Asia, and to transform that relationship from primarily economic rivalry into primarily strategic partnership. This is why his first trip to Asia, he goes to Tokyo and Seoul and not to Beijing. All right. The other part of his priority is to provide reassurances, enough of a defense commitment to Taiwan that even though Taiwan no longer has diplomatic relations with the U.S., Taiwan will not be fully abandoned. And that's why he works hard. And then Schultz helps conclude the third communique in 1982 of continuing to provide a continued commitment to peaceful resolution of cross-strait differences and American arms for Taiwan to deter a Chinese attack. That context is important because after those settlements get done, after Nakasone comes to power in November of '82, I think it is, and Reagan has a real partner with Japan, after Taiwan now has the assurances of continued American support, Reagan then turns back to China and says, let's forge a pragmatic, constructive partnership based on shared interests. And he travels to China in the spring of 1984. He is fascinated by the country. He has great affection for the people. He values the partnership with China in countering the Soviet Union. He knows that China is helpful in tying down like 60 or 70 Soviet divisions there. He assures Deng Xiaoping of his commitment to, getting rid of all of the Soviet SS-20s, intermediate range nuclear missiles that were not just threatening Western Europe, but were also threatening Beijing, Tokyo, and Seoul. Right, so there's a security commitment there. And he also expresses hope that China will continue its economic reforms and modernization. And he's very clear, he hopes that China will embrace democracy. And if you read his Fudan University speech or also his address to people in Beijing, he's very clear on this is the future hope that he has for China. Thus far, those part of the hope have not materialized. But meanwhile, he says, but we can work together on these areas of shared interest.
So let me wrap up. Are you? Yeah. So I really hope you are intrigued enough by this discussion to read The Peacemaker, Ronald Reagan in the White House and the World. It was, I mean, I'm probably giving away a trade secret. It was how many pages?
608.
It was it was 1,000 pages.
And my editor made me cut out 400 pages. So if it seems long, you should have seen the first version.
So we are hoping the U.S. Studies Center can get the director's cut with all the juicy details about his relationship with Bob Hawke in Australia, which got cut from the final version. But it's really a both towering and authoritative book, but also a very readable book. I mean, it's not a biography, but it does read like a biography. You really care what happens to the story, and it's really hard to put down. And extremely well researched. So we'll conclude now. We'll turn the mics off. People can ask a few questions before we take Will to a fancy dinner. But let's finish up by thanking Will for this really interesting discussion. Thank you very much.